Thank you very much for coming on this beautiful day, and thank you for inviting us to come. When I opened the program, I saw the title of my talk was The Beginning of Frankenstein. There are two things to recommend the title. One is I didn't write it, so it feels like it's authoritative because it didn't come out of me. The other is that it means almost anything. The beginning of Frankenstein. Well, what can be the beginning of Frankenstein? There are many ways of thinking about how this work begins, and I just want to go over a few possible ways of thinking about the beginning of Frankenstein and talk a little bit about the work, and then I'll pass it over to my co-editor and life partner, and she'll talk about substantial matters. First of all, Frankenstein begins as a myth. I mean, there's a very powerful, deep myth about creating life, making something not alive, and turning it into life. My father used to tell me when I was uppity, he said, you know, you're the product of unskilled labor, which, I mean, maybe was a reflection on him. But the Frankenstein myth has to do with creating human beings as a product of skilled labor, as an act of will and intellect, control and imagination, actually seizing the point at which the non-living becomes living. Is there some way of mastering that? And that's been a fantasy that goes back as far as people have been writing. I mean, if you look back at the ancient Greeks thinking about creating automata, creating things that appear to be alive or have the illusion of being alive, or myths of statues coming to life. I mean, now we're used to seeing comedians in the streets pretending to be statues. I mean, that actually goes back to the Middle Ages for people pretending to be tableau vivant, they're called. But that dream of crossing the boundary between the living and the non-living. So the myth has to do with, we all know the myth of Pygmalion, an ivory statue coming to life. That suggests something erotic about bringing things to life. As if you bring something not alive and give it life. It's like taking a sexual fantasy and giving it flesh. So there's an element of the erotic in bringing things to life. There's also the feeling of power. The Golem story, which many people know. I wish Mary Shelley had written somewhere, gee, of course it would be great to do research on the Golem and use that. But you all know the story of the clay figure created by the Jews to protect themselves. And if you ever saw the early film of the Golem, it uses both the protective power and the scary power of the Golem and the comic power of the Golem. The Golem at one scene is going shopping in a grocery store and he's squeezing the fruits and vegetables to see if they're ripe. I mean, what would you do if you built a monster? You'd put him to work, you know that? And so he does household work. So you have that myth. But the myth that clearly is in Mary Shelley's mind throughout the writing of this is the Prometheus myth. Prometheus as the creator of mankind out of clay, in some way taking something that he shouldn't have done, which is the secret of the gods, creating something alive, creating a human, and then later on giving it the gift of fire, giving it divine gifts. I think one thing that Mary Shelley loved about the Prometheus myth, and why she saw it as kind of a beginning of her work, is that it's so, what critics sometimes call, polyvalent. It can mean so many things and have so many values. Prometheus is a hero. Prometheus is a sinner. Prometheus is a sufferer. And Prometheus can mean all sorts of things. If you look in the novel, which character is the modern Prometheus? Well, it should be he's not a doctor. Actually, Victor Frankenstein is not a doctor. He gets a bump up in status when he gets into the movies. But young Victor Frankenstein is a Prometheus. But the monster, or better, the creature, because others call him monster. The creature is also something of a Prometheus, suffering because he has human consciousness. And that, in part, is what the Prometheus myth is about. Creating a creature and giving it a spark of consciousness, bringing it not only from the inanimate, but from the brutal to human. Okay. So those are various, that's one, so the mythic backgrounds of Frankenstein. I do want to say that background really came home to me when I started working on this. I agreed to work on this with my wife. It's her field, the 19th century. I'm 15th and 16th and 17th century. I really it really came home to me because when I was working on this, one of my deadlines was that I was having open heart surgery. And I had just discovered that they actually stop your heart, so they can work on it. It makes perfect sense. How can you work on a heart when it's flopping around in there? So they actually stop your heart and a machine runs it for you. But the thought of actually being on a slab, pretty much almost dead, except for the machines, for like 5 or 6 hours, and being brought back to life. I mean, that's the Frankenstein story. You take something and bring it off a slab. So that's part of the mythic interest of it for me. Okay. Another possible meaning of the beginning of Frankenstein is the importance of it for Mary Shelley herself. You probably know there's a controversy about whether she wrote the work or Percy wrote the work. It's not the same group that says that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, but it's the same, to me, what my grandmother would call the same mishigas. I mean, it's entirely possible. You know, there's no way. I mean, I wasn't there. I mean, I didn't have a camera running while she was writing it. But the evidence, which is gone over a good deal in our edition, is that Mary wrote it and he helped do some revisions. But what is so interesting about this for Mary as a beginning is that in some ways this is Mary's declaration of herself as an equal to the young men that she's with. Now remember, she's a brilliant, very young woman. I almost said girl, but she's a very young woman, 18 years old. And she's with these brilliant young men who are a little older, more accomplished. And she has to prove herself. In 1831, 13 years after the first edition, when they put out the revised edition, she included a long preface that wasn't in the first edition, describing what it was like to try to write this work. It was supposed to be a sort of a contest, you know, a ghost stories while it was raining out. But the way she describes it is fascinating. She says, my husband always wanted me to show my brilliance, to show my intelligence, to show that I was worthy of my great parents. Of course, her parents were great intellectuals, controversial intellectuals. They wanted to show me. But it wasn't so much that he thought what I would do now would make me famous. He wanted me to write something now to prove myself to him, so he could judge to see how much talent I had. I mean, that's horrible when I read that. I think, you know, how could this marriage survive? Well, fortunately, he died young and they didn't have to divorce. He was something of a cad. But this work is in some way the creation of herself as an author and an intellectual, the equal of the men around her. That's why I think it's so cruel to try to deny her the authorship of it. But nonetheless, so it's in some ways, it's her dream of herself becoming one as great as the men she's with. Very adventurous young woman. Anyway, there's another sense in which Frankenstein has a beginning for us. I mean, for most of us, I mean, I'm a baby boomer. I mean, I don't want to ask people their ages, but for most of us, Frankenstein originates in a business deal made in 1957 by Universal Pictures to put together the horror movies they made in the 30s and 40s and put them on TV. And that's where most of us first saw Frankenstein. My father saw Frankenstein in 1931. He was a 14-year-old boy and he saw it. And when the movie was going to come out again on TV, he said, son, you've got to watch this movie. And it's, you remember guys like Zachary, the TV shows on Creature Features or Shock Theater. I mean, all these movies came out. That's when Frankenstein sort of came lumbering into our lives. And Boris Karloff is James Whale, but Boris Karloff played the monster. It's a great film. It's silly. The sky in the background, you can see the wrinkles from the bad sets in it. I mean, it's like a bad theater production. But the Boris Karloff production, his acting is so wonderful. The makeup, which disguises and reveals him at the same time. You see the humanity come through the monstrosity. It's completely different from the creature in the novel. You know, the creature in the novel is very eloquent. I mean, he's read Milton. You know, he's read Plutarch's Lives. But he's even though Karloff doesn't speak, he's like he comes out of silent films. He is eloquent with his face and with his hands. He has the most wonderful gestures. It's this gesture. Please accept me for human. You know, and that's what the monster actually says in the novel over the course of thousands of words. You know, please accept me. Please love me. And that hand gesture is something that I think is one of the great moments in the 1930s filmmaking. That sort of, oh, he even makes a little noise, like that, sort of like, please, okay. My beginning, her beginning, the beginning of the novel itself. Now, the novel itself, when you start reading it, when anybody starts reading it, is something of a disappointment because it's not like what you expect. It's not, I mean, it's self-conscious in certain Gothic elements, but it doesn't have, it has its dark and rainy nights. But the novel is very intellectual. It's structured in a way that's quite cunning. In some ways, it almost sounds like, when you describe it, almost like a Borges short story. The way you have things inside of things, or fictions inside of fictions inside of fictions. There's something very, except it doesn't feel tricky. The way, like, and I love Borges because how tricky he feels. That's what I love about him. It's like watching a great magician. But it begins with a preface. The first edition began with a preface probably written by Percy, pretending to be Mary. But it's a preface about dreaming. dream of being a great writer. Talks about Homer, talks about Shakespeare, talks about Milton, and it says these men created something, a sense of a comprehensiveness of human passions. This work is going to try to do something like it. From there, you move into this, in the beginning of the story, it's a series of letters written by an explorer who wants to go to the North Pole, Robert Walton. You wonder, when are we going to get to the monster? You know, it's, a lot of students are very impatient, you know. North Pole, who cares about this? But he's also a dreamer. He wants to go to a land of eternal light. He wants to discover something great for mankind. He's an idealist and a dreamer. He then discovers another dreamer. It's Victor Frankenstein starving to death in the ice. And Frankenstein tells his life story to Walton. And he's also a dreamer. He dreams about creating something no one has ever created before. Discovering the secret of life. Creating a whole new species that will regard him as their god. They'll give him, it's a sort of fantastic, idealistic dreamer. And then the dreamer himself talks about a creature he creates. He discovers the secret. He gives his little life story about his boyhood, about his going away to Ingolstadt, about being a student, and discovering with ridiculous ease, as if it floods on him with light, the secret of life. And then he talks about, after that, trying to create, the nightmares start beginning by having to put together the figure. But he still thinks he's going to do something wonderful. And then the creature comes to life. And let me just read to you from the very famous moment when the creature comes to life in the book. It's book 1, chapter 4. I almost said act 1, scene 4. I'm so used to lecturing on Shakespeare that I'm sort of out of my element. But act 1, scene 4, the creature comes to life. Begins with something that sounds almost like a joke. I mean, but for those who know, it was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull, yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. What I love about that introduction is how disappointing it is the first time you read it, which is, where's all the lightning? You know, where are those wonderful special effects that were made in the 1931 movie and that continue to be used for 20 or 30 years later? They never threw out any of the junk around. They kept sparking, and all the cheap horror, you see these cheap horror movies with alcoholic Lon Chaney staggering around, and it's the same machines in the background giving off the spark. What's wonderful about it is like the emergence of a dream into life. The word spark is really almost a metaphor. I mean, Frankenstein was interested in electricity. You know, galvanism was a big thing in Mary Shelley's day. So she must have imagined some electricity, but she doesn't talk about it. What she's interested in is the emergence of the strange creature as if out of a dream. And then throughout the rest of the work, the middle part of the work is taken up by the creature giving his story. So you have a story inside of a story inside of a story, and you have the ultimate dreamer. As someone who faces the brute reality of not being accepted as human, but his dream, and the ultimate dream, is to be acknowledged as human, to be loved, to be eloquent, to be accepted, and then to be rejected, discovering the dream turning into a nightmare over and over again. Until at the very end of the novel, he disappears into the North Pole himself as the last dreamer. In fact, one of the things that I love about the novel is that it always struck me that Mary Shelley, who was the first dreamer outside the novel, and the creature who's at the center of a series of dreams, is in some ways like Mary Shelley, wanting to be acknowledged, wanting to be presented as someone who is human like anyone else, as she wanted to be acknowledged as a brilliant young woman surrounded by all these brilliant, slightly older men. So anyway, that's how Frankenstein begins for me, and I cheated a little bit by bringing in the end.
Hard act to follow. Well, the thing about Frankenstein is that it has many beginnings, but it also seems to be unending. Every time there is an unforeseen consequence of terrifying dimensions in the world of science, foreign policy, music, or fashion, the word Frankenstein is not far behind. This is a Frankenstein fashion. We have a Frankenstein foreign policy in Syria. It was just in the New York Times last week, and you can just wait for that term to recur. It's become part of our cultural language for good intentions, high ideals, descending into terrifying specters and consequences. Victor Frankenstein starts out with a high ideal. He wants to find out if he can penetrate the boundaries between life and death in order to create a being that would be immune to death except by extraordinary catastrophes. The reason he wants to do this is that his mother died of scarlet fever in nursing his sister, and he was traumatized by that and decided that this was going to be his project, was finding a solution to human mortality. So he has that basic impulse of high ideals, but in the midst of his scientific studies, he gets very sort of forgetful of the human consequences. He spends 9 months, Mary Shelley was very deliberate about this, in his laboratory, in charnel houses. I always tell my students he doesn't check in with his advisors, and he winds up creating, as an undergraduate at the University of Ingolstadt, which was a sort of the Berkeley of the late 18th century, a cutting place edge of progressive science and political thinking. It was the home of the Illuminati, the out there scientists and philosophers who were often blamed for the French Revolution, coming up with a philosophy of democracy. Well, Victor Frankenstein is doing his thing in the laboratory, and he has this moment of lightning clarification. He discovers the secret of life, but he's been inside for 9 months. He's not gotten out into nature. He hasn't written home. He hasn't taken care of himself. His body has become emaciated. His eyes are starting from their sockets. And he creates a creature who looks rather unhuman. It's a kind of massive, serious joke on God creating man in his own image. Victor Frankenstein's steadily denaturing of his humanity, which involves torturing animals, vivisection as part of his research, produces a creature, at least in outward form, who is not the ideal beauty that Victor Frankenstein imagined that he was creating, but someone who is so physically different that he is unacceptable to humanity. Now, Mary Shelley was writing this in an era in which all kinds of decisions were made about people based on physical disappearance, physical difference, and accidents of physical appearance that excluded them from humane treatment by the dominant classes in Europe. Most atrociously, of course, the slave trade. Not for nothing does Victor Frankenstein talk about his creature as being of a different species or a different race. That word comes up in Frankenstein. But there were also the poor who were exerting their rights or claiming their rights in the wake of the French Revolution of 1789. Frankenstein is set in the 1790s, who were described by the upper classes as monsters, as aberrations from humanity. And then there was a general issue for women, just by the physical difference of being a woman. Who were excluded from all kinds of civil, political, and legal rights, and regarded as monsters if you pointed that out. This was the case with Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, who was regarded as a monster for writing A Vindication of the Rights of Woman as her sequel to A Vindication of the Rights of Man, which was her defense of the French Revolution. She pretty much said liberty, fraternity, and equality was taken a little too literally on the fraternity part, and that for women there was still a lot of cultural, political, and philosophical work to be done. She died 10 days after giving birth to Mary Shelley, her daughter Mary, from postpartum poisoning. Common childbirth was a hazard. It was a hazard of marriage, and a lot of women died in childbirth or just from the exhaustion of serial pregnancies. But Mary Shelley came into the world as a little creature who had killed the woman that her father loved. And she said she never felt fully loved by her father. He did his best by her and by his stepdaughter, but this was a real ordeal for him, and it registered on Mary Shelley, who came into the world as something of a monster. through no fault of her own, but just a horrific accident. And in many ways, this is a kind of woman's thinking through a novel about the obligations of parents to children, and then in broader social terms, the obligation of society to its weak and its outcast and its unacceptable. So one of the ways that Frankenstein begins is not just with Robert Walton's letters, but on its very title page. But I want to talk a little bit about that. So it's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. And that already gives us, okay, a name with a mystery. We don't hear the name Frankenstein until after that creation scene, when Victor Frankenstein runs out of the laboratory. He's horrified at what he's done, wanders around at night, comes back in the morning, and goes into massive denial and decides he's going to pretend it never happened. And then his best friend from childhood shows up, gets out of the coach, and says, Frankenstein. And that's the first time you hear his name. You don't even know who he is at that point. What we do have is this overloaded epithet, the modern Prometheus. Ron's talked very nicely about what the old Prometheus is, but who's the modern Prometheus? Well, one person we all know in the US is Ben Franklin, who was called the modern Prometheus because he stole the lightning from the sky and he stole the scepter from tyrants. That was a double credit to him. That was the motto underneath a statue of him that was done in honor that was made in France as one of the principles of the American Revolution. So he got electricity going, but he also stole the scepter from the tyrants. And that is one thing Prometheus does. He goes up against Jove and steals the fire from heaven and gives it to man to make him human. So that's a modern Prometheus. But there was another modern Prometheus who emerged in the 1790s and gave a lot of trouble to monarchs, and his name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And he brought along 25 years of world war and an incredible catastrophe for people who thought that he represented modern political progress. The French Revolution ended the monarchy, brought high ideals into high hopes in the 1790s, early 1790s. William Wordsworth wrote, "Bliss was it at dawn to be alive, to be young and very heaven." It was like being in Berkeley in the 60s. But by 1792, the revolution had descended into a civil war, sometimes known as the Reign of Terror. And France was purging anyone suspected of royalist sympathies. And then Napoleon Bonaparte came along and said, no, we have to stop fighting with each other. We are going to export the revolution and take down every monarchy in Europe, as well as a couple of republics. Where the supporters of the revolution felt a real qualm of dismay is when Napoleon invaded the Republic of Venice and the Republic of Switzerland. Okay to rattle the cages of the monarchy, Byron liked that, Hazlitt liked that, but then invading republics, maybe this guy is a monster rather than a liberator. So I'm only halfway down the title page. The next part of the title page is Mary Shelley's nod to Paradise Lost. Harold Bloom has called Frankenstein the biggest footnote to Paradise Lost ever. And it is a rethinking of Paradise Lost as a creation myth in modern times. We get 3 lines from Paradise Lost, and it's after the fall. Adam is alone in the garden, ranting at God, who has told him that he shouldn't have listened to his wife, that he's going to lose Eden, that he's going to die, that his wife is going to die, his children are going to die, and all of humanity is going to die because of him. He's been busted big time by Dad, and this is what he says. "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Mary Shelley puts that. 3 lines. She doesn't say who's speaking to whom. So it's really a question that we all recognize from our zingers to our own parents. And if you've got children, they've probably done it to you. I didn't ask to be born. And it's a very potent kind of statement because when Adam says it to God, God has given him the Garden of Eden. When Adam tells God that he's lonely, God gives him Eve. He just gives him one rule that he can't break. But over the course of 3 volumes, that title page is reprinted at the front of each volume. And it shifts in its valences as it does. You begin to hear this as the creature's complaint to Victor Frankenstein. Now, we know that he was born on a dark and rainy night in November. Dad looks at him, runs out of the lab in horror at what he's done. The creature staggers around in confusion, finds some rag of a cloak, and wanders out of the laboratory and into the German woods in the middle of November and has to fend for himself. That's a very different level of complaint. When he finally catches up with Victor Frankenstein in Chamonix across a field of ice, all he wants from him is a companion. He wants Frankenstein to make a female creature for him. And then he promises to leave and go to South America and never be heard from again. Victor Frankenstein starts this project, but he won't do it. So this is a profound philosophical inquiry about what kinds of obligations creators owe to their creatures. And it has a lot to do with what you mean by naming the creature at all. We made a very deliberate decision to use creature as the reference for Victor Frankenstein's creature, but I think monster is the cultural default, and it's tendentious, it's prejudicial, it makes a judgment based on the appearance of physical difference. Everyone who I think teaches this novel, reads it, looks at any interpretation of it, has to think about what to call this forever nameless being. Monster has become the most popular epithet, but the novel constantly puts this naming forward as a problem. The term appears almost 36 times in the novel, mostly for Frankenstein's creature, but there are two very interesting exceptions. One is a young woman unjustly convicted of murder is harassed by her confessor before her execution to confess until I began to think I was the monster that he said I was. Monster is an epithet applied rather than an innate characteristic. And then a close friend of hers who's testified at the trial says that the courtroom is full of men who seem monsters thirsting for each other's blood. In both these cases, monster is not innate depravity, but a name for behavior that seems depraved. So being and creature have become kind of neutral terms, foregrounding the fact that this being has been created, and there's a link between the creature and his creator. Being also bids fair to join the other community of beings known as human beings. So it's a being without the human being, as a kind of crisis of how we are going to accommodate this. So I want to shift over to something that might surprise you and talk a little bit about two possible other monsters. Ron's given you that creation scene, and he stopped with the moment of animation. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs, reports Victor Frankenstein. Notice that it. Now this is the scene that the movies adore, with storms and electricity, mechanical contrivances, explosions, light shows, kites in the air, and Kenneth Strickfaden's unequaled electronic apparatus. And yet here's the next paragraph of Victor Frankenstein's report to Robert Walton, that polar explorer. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful. Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. This is a kind of horrible parody of a Renaissance form known as the blason, in which a lover itemizes the attributes of his mistress that he adores. Those teeth like pearls, those eyes like limpid pools. There's a wonderful Mae West moment in I'm No Angel where Cary Grant is sort of going through the blason with her. And she says, "Are you flirting with me or taking inventory?" This is the sort of horrible inversion of that. And this is a list of everything that repels not only love, affection, but just basic recognition of a fellow creature. And it becomes all about Victor Frankenstein. I'd worked for almost 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body, and for this I deprived myself of rest and health. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room. It all becomes about his disappointment, and we don't hear from that creature for several chapters into the novel. Halfway through the novel, he catches up with his creator. We get a very different account from a different perspective of that moment. Ellen Moores, who was a pioneering feminist critic, has a great essay called The Female Gothic. Do you know this? You were nodding your head. And it begins with a paragraph that some of you may know. A baby at birth is usually disappointing looking to a parent who hasn't seen one before. His skin is coated with wax, which is left on will be absorbed slowly and will lessen the chance of rashes. His skin underneath is apt to be very red. His face tends to be puffy and lumpy, and there may be black and blue marks. The head is misshapen, low in the forehead, elongated at the back, and quite lopsided. Occasionally, there may be a hematoma, a localized hemorrhage under the scalp that sticks out as a distinct bump and takes weeks to go away. A couple of days after the birth, there may be a touch of jaundice, which is visible for about a week. The baby's body is covered all over with fuzzy hair. For a couple of weeks afterward, there's apt to be dry scaling of the skin, which is also shed. Some babies have black hair on the scalp at first, which may come far down on the forehead. Well, this isn't from a horror story novel of the 18th century. It's from the 1957 edition of Dr. Benjamin Spock's household familiar and best-selling Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. And he wants to tell parents that the Hallmark card is not necessarily what your first sight is going to be. And that's for the possible letdown or even recoil of a normal newborn. What if a baby who is physically abnormal or deficient, or maybe just the wrong sex? Frankenstein represents a kind of limit case of a baby you cannot love from its first breath, a shocked recoil. That's the extravagant nightmare of normal parental anxiety. And Shelley imprints the creature with that kind of nightmare that is a kind of worst nightmare for every parent. I want to suggest that the first monster in the novel, that's Victor Frankenstein's word, is not this creature, however. It's one that appears to Robert Walton while he's trying to find the Northwest Passage through the ice. And they see a guy float by on a piece of ice with one living sled dog, and he asks which way the ship is going. Like this should matter to him. Are you going north? Okay, good. Maybe I'll let you take me on board. Good God, Margaret, Robert Walton writes to his sister, if you had seen the man who thus capitulated for his safety, your surprise would have been boundless. His limbs were nearly frozen and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. I never saw a man in so wretched a condition. This is the first dreadful wretch in Mary Shelley's novel, and soon the star of its first Frankenstein moment. This wretched being faints dead away on the ship deck, and then is revived, actually animated by the crew. We restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. As soon as he showed signs of life, we wrapped him up in blankets, placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees, he recovered and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully. The crew is a sort of corporate Jewish mother here. But they wrap him up in blankets. They place him next to a warm chimney. They feed him soup. They hover over him. They care for him. They bring him back from life to death. The crew actually brings life out of death in a body dreadful to behold, teeth gnashing, mad and wild. Victor Frankenstein receives concerned parental care as a fellow human being. Everything he recounts thereafter bears this tremendous irony. Monsters are not born, the author of Frankenstein proposes. They are made and unmade in the variable scales of human sympathy. Questions? Even if you haven't read the novel, this is a sort of massive cultural myth. We're happy to talk about it too.
Has anyone seen the English version, the film, the play version? Oh, I'm sorry, there are questions.
That's just what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
If any of you had seen it, what your thoughts were on it.
They're coming around they're bringing the film around to various theaters of the two productions, one
Yes.
of the two roles switched.
Yes.
I have not seen it, but I'm looking forward to it because I love the Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
He's such a gorgeous guy.
But
I'd love to see him in this creature.
It's on round 3 around the country, so check the National Theater Live homepage.
What's this?
Yeah, what it
Film?
is.
We're talking about, why don't you,
Oh, well, this way. Excuse me. It's a National Theater Live production with Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller. And in the original production, the theater production, they switched roles every night. So one would play Frankenstein and one would play the creature. And the film of the theater production starring Benedict Cumberbatch as the creature is currently on tour for the 3rd time around the country. I highly recommend it. It'll make you cry.
a lot of books.
In this version, he plays the creature.
Oh, what's it called?
Oh, it's called Frankenstein. It's called Frankenstein.
And then in a couple of weeks, you're going to send the other version around. So
I think so.
I know at
I
Princeton
think
they're
so.
doing that, and then you can
And,
get to see the other version. I'd like to have them on one night, but the double header's a little much.
Yeah, and I haven't read the book, but watching the film makes me want to read the book.
Yeah.
Because it is very touching. It'll make you cry at the end.
Yeah.
And all of these questions come up in
Yeah.
the production.
And they are very clearly alter egos. Mary Shelley writes the tale in which you see Victor Frankenstein and the creature as I'm giving you a kind of parallel already, where Victor Frankenstein's first emergence in the novel is as a creature that gets loved. But that kind of alter ego, that kind of twinning, but with a difference, is in play all the way through the novel. So this production is brilliant in having the two actors switch roles. Sandy, you have.
I did. Just kind of a sequel and a prequel at the same time. When you and I were talking, you mentioned something about the fact that the ages of Mary Shelley and Jane Austen and the time of the books were published, and I wonder if you could share that with everybody, because I found that fairly interesting.
Well, it's very interesting. Jane Austen's last novels were published in 1818. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published in 1818. That was the year the first edition of Frankenstein was published. So, they were in some ways, exact contemporaries, though Jane Austen was, Mary Shelley was by this point 21, and Jane Austen was, she was dead by 1818, but she was 42. She would have been 42. So they're slightly different generations, but it is amazing to think that this was the world in which female-authored novels were really becoming tremendously popular. Jane Austen was not popular in her own lifetime, and the first edition of Frankenstein did not sell out either. These were published in runs of about 500, but by the 1830s, when Bentley Standard Authors reproduced all of Jane Austen's novels and did the 1831 edition of Frankenstein with Mary Shelley's now sort of short story preface on how a polite young girl came to write such a horrific tale. Those novels went wide. They went into thousands and thousands of copies, and Jane Austen has never been out of print since the 1830s, and Frankenstein, I think to the horror of all her male rivals, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, has never gone out of print. It was always, her father put another edition out in 1823 after the success of several London stage plays. Mary Shelley went to one, and she saw that the creature was identified by a blank. And she said, what a great, naming of the nameless. But she was witnessing the novel's first fame, and it was as a stage play. Many more people knew Frankenstein as a stage play in the 1820s and even across the 19th century than they did from reading the novel. So it's one of those sort of cultural productions where when it goes pop, it almost eclipses the original novel, which is a highly literary production. The 1831 novel, for instance, did not have that bit from Paradise Lost on the cover. Way too literary and made people scared that they had to know who Milton was and have read Milton in order to get into the novel. So Bentley was no fool. He just took that off the cover. Though everybody inside Frankenstein not only has read Paradise Lost, but they keep quoting it to each other and keep identifying with the characters. So it's in the air and in circulation. That's a long answer to your question, Sandy.
What's Bentley?
Bentley and Coburn Standard Authors series. They were entrepreneurial publishers, and this was number 9, and it was packaged with Schiller's Ghost Seer. So it was being marketed as a kind of horror ghost story by the 1830s, and that's already a kind of rebranding. There was a question back here, yeah.
Thanks for being here. I had 2 questions. One being, do you know anything about how the movie theater decided to make the monster or the creature inarticulate? Because I mean, I had the same experience, like growing up with this like thing, and the masks and everything as a kid, and then actually reading the book, it's so vastly different.
As early as 1823, with the first stage play, the creature was turned into this lumbering mass that was not articulate. And so this was the kind of processing of Frankenstein across the 19th century and into stage plays to such an extent that Boris Karloff thought he was actually intervening and radically reformulating the creature by making him sympathetic, pathetic, needy, someone whom you might pity, someone whom you might even weep for. And there are supplements in The Bride of Frankenstein that play that out even more fully when he visits a blind man in a cottage and gets his first friend, and they smoke cigars and drink wine together and things like that. But I mean, Karloff really reintroduced pathos to the character, and it was monosyllabic, but it was still better than this mute, lumbering, terrifying, unhuman mass that had become the kind of popular evolution of the creature.
But to some degree, the 1931 Frankenstein is more humanized than what they wanted to do originally. I mean, apparently Bela Lugosi was going to play the role originally, and they had him in this sort of gigantic, sort of ape-like outfit, and he said, "This is ridiculous, and I have no lines, I'm a star." And some of the early makeups are making him into a mechanical man. If they have sketches of the early, they were going to make him actually into sort of a robot, was one of the So what we have here, even though he lumbers around, is still made more poignant. But you're right about the loss of language. To some degree, it may be a throwback to silent movies. He's like a creature from the silent film. Lon Chaney was going to be the great horror actor into the sound era also, and then he died of cancer. So Bela Lugosi took his place as Dracula, and then where do you go from there? I mean, you had all these new stars rising up, like Boris Karloff, and then later Chaney's son. He called himself Lon Jr., but he wasn't knowing his name.
Thank you, Ron and Susan. At this time,